Hey guys, this is Michael Kong here.
This is Emiliano Esparza.
And we're here to present to you Chapter 20, so prepare to be amazed. So first off, we have the menace of secession, Lincoln's inauguration on March 4th of 1861. And at this point, or even before this point, there are 7 states that had already seceded, and there were some questions and problems that came along with this. So if they did secede, then who would take the debt with the huge national debt that they had? How would they divide the land and the frontier on the west? Could war actually solve slavery? It's a good question, huh?
It is a good question.
And probably the biggest thing was the foreign relations. Abraham Lincoln always thought that a house divided could not stand, and he thought that if the North and South fell apart or divided, then it would be much easier to conquer. Now, the first trigger of the war is probably the South Carolina attack of Fort Sumter. So after the states seceded, they took control of the public property in the states, so including arsenals, mints, and forts. But something that they couldn't take, or that South couldn't take, was Fort Sumter. I can't speak. In Charleston, South Carolina. So that fort actually didn't really have many supplies. It was still being supported by the North. So Lincoln wanted to help them out. He sent them a naval force with supplies, and the South took it the wrong way. They thought they were trying to attack them or something. And so on April 12th, 1861, the Carolinians attacked. Now this shocked the North, because the fort was lost, but the Union was saved. Because it kind of brought the Union back together. It showed them that they were actually being attacked and that they needed to wage war. So Lincoln, he had saw that 4 more states had joined the Confederacy, and he wanted to bring together a 75,000 soldier army. So the thing with these 4 states, the border states, was Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland. Lincoln wanted to keep them in the Union because Delaware and Maryland were surrounding Washington, so if they became slave states or they joined the South, then the capital would be surrounded. They were also very high in manufacturing and had a lot of people that could join the army. So if those 4 states joined the South, then the North would be in really big trouble. Now in terms of brothers' blood, you have Billy Yank representing the North and Johnny Reb representing the South. And this represents how there were a lot of brothers fighting against each other. It's just really sad. Now you have a balance of forces, so there are a lot of advantages on both sides. The Norths were definitely in industry, transportation, including the railroads. They had a very strong navy and government at Washington, and a larger population. Compared to the South, they had 22 million versus the South only having 9 million. They also did have lots of disadvantages, including military leaders. Most military leaders, or the best ones, including Robert E. Lee, went to the South. And the northern states were simply apathetic. They didn't really care about the South seceding. They just wanted to let them do their own thing and then have them do their own thing. Now, the southern advantages were, like I said before, they had better generals. They had Robert E. Lee. North also had Ulysses S. Grant, but Grant was only a lieutenant, while Lee was a general, so he was probably better or something. They were fighting a defensive war, so they didn't actually have to win. They just had to not lose. And they were fighting for a purpose. They fought for what they truly believed in, which was that slavery was okay. Some of their disadvantages were they didn't have a structured government or a navy, and they were lacking in industry and transportation, a direct advantage or disadvantage from the North. Now, dethroning King Cotton. Now, there's the idea that the American Revolution was pretty much only successful because of the French intervention. And so the South wanted to get help from Europe. Now the British ruling classes were upset still at American democracy, so they were thinking, oh, maybe we could help the South. They sympathized with the Southern aristocrats that had their plantations, but they wanted to tear down American democracy. Now on the other hand, the masses who had read Uncle Tom's Cabin were inspired and were led to believe that war actually could end slavery. So they were against what the ruling classes wanted. Now this whole idea of King Cotton was that the British would help the South because the South supplied cotton to British manufacturing. But this failed because the South had actually been overproductive and given the British way too much cotton in the other years, and so British had a surplus. Now other reasons that the South failed to get help from Britain was that the North had captured cotton supplies from the South and sent them to Britain, and the Egyptian and Indian cotton manufacturing actually increased. As for diplomacy, there are two main events that occurred in this time period. There was the Trent Affair that occurred in 1861, where a Union warship captured two Confederate diplomats traveling to Europe trying to get help from the British. And the British were pretty mad at this. They demanded an apology, as it was their ship that they stopped. But Lincoln kind of fixed all of this as he released the two Confederate diplomats, and that probably avoided another war. Now the Alabama, it was a British ship, it was British built, that the Confederates actually took over and started using as their own. And this kind of shows the weakness of the British law to stay neutral in this war. And even after this, the Confederates continued to take more and more British ships, and they crippled the Union Navy very greatly.
So now on to foreign flare-ups. Like we said before, Abraham Lincoln believed that a house divided against itself cannot stand. What that philosophy basically means that if the North and the South were engaged in a long drawn-out conflict, then European powers, much like Britain, could swoop in and end the American experiment as he saw it. So, President Davis versus President Lincoln, as you see here embodied by the political cartoons, the two were seen as opposing foes because they represented a whole other different view of what an American life should be. Whereas Lincoln believed in equality and freedom for most people, Jefferson Davis believed in upholding the status quo, and at the time the status quo meant slavery. Now, the South had a very weak constitution because the fact that they were very new. Their constitution was about as weak as the Articles of Confederation were after the American Revolution. But the North, because they were able to keep the original source of way of government that the framers created, was a lot more powerful, especially in their administration. So the limitations on wartime liberties. This was a lot more important, more in the North than the South, because in the North, if you were viewed as a supporter of the Confederacy, you were harassed by the local police, or especially the people, because there was a great deal of resentment in the North for the South because of the fact that the South technically shot first, meaning they fired at Fort Sumter, and they were the ones to start the conflict because both they left the Union and they started to attack the Union. Whereas in the South, the people that were fighting believed in their cause, and there wasn't really much cause to censor them. Now, both armies needed vast amounts of men because it was the most costly war in American history, whereas we have about almost 700,000 people dying. Now in the South, volunteers were mostly unpaid but militiamen because they believed in the whole idea of slavery and how it was the foundation for their lives and their livelihood, so they believed that they needed to fight to protect that ideal. While in the North, it was mostly based upon anger towards the South for breaking up the Union, and very little of it was actually because they believed slavery was wrong. Most of it was either financially, whereas in the North, because of the large amount of money they had, they were able to offer bonuses to soldiers for joining the army, and they wanted to be able to crush the South for even starting war with them and trying to break up the Union. Now, the economic stress of war was a lot more pronounced in the South because the South, due to the fact that it had a weak government, it was unable to levy taxes or tariffs or do international trade because of the fact that they had a weak system. Whereas in the North, because of the already set up things like manufacturing, trading, and the amount of railroads they had, they were much better able to weather the storm of war rather than the South, who were barely able to print money. The North recognized, though, that war would be costly early and imposed more taxes so they could be able to pay for the war and raise the 75,000-man army within weeks that President Lincoln wanted. Now, a lot of this ties into the North's economic boom because the wealth in the North was a lot greater than the wealth in the South. Even though they had cash crops like cotton, no one was buying them, both because the amount of bad, say, publicity that went in with trading with the South due to its pattern of slavery, and the fact that they were behind the times in manufacturing and trading, whereas they had a lot less railroads or things like that than the Union. And advancements in the Union, such as the telegram and mass producing items and being able to trade those internationally, made the North's economic boom a lot more pronounced, and was ultimately one of the major factors that led to their victory over the South. Now, finally, a collapsed Cotton Kingdom. The North completely overwhelmed the South in both manpower and the ability that they had to wage war. The South really couldn't wage war on the scale that the North could, due to the fact that they had their manufacturing down. They outnumbered the South almost 2-1. So any factors going for the South, such as a defensive war and how good their military leaders were, really didn't matter against the crushing onslaught of northern aggression. And the South eventually surrendered to Appomattox Courthouse, where General Robert E. Lee surrendered his Virginia army to General Ulysses S. Grant. Subscribe here to join our channel. Yeah.
That's not actually a link. I just wanted to put that there.
Oh, okay. Get out of here, Gabe.
You didn't say thanks for watching. Thanks for watching.
Yeah, thanks for watching.